Now let me get into a few things that I am going to be able to flesh out a bit during the course of this presentation. One is on the construction of homosexuality. The idea that, and when I say the construction of homosexuality, I do not mean that somewhere around the late 19th century, along the time when the Industrial Revolution was on the rise and capitalism was fully flourishing, that somehow people began to diddle with each other differently. That is not the case. I absolutely assure you that so long as human beings have walked this planet, they have done all sorts of creative things in all sorts of creative ways. Said nothing new is happening unless, you know, and I insist on this, that no matter how creative you and your girlfriend, or you and your boyfriend, or you and your 2 girlfriends and your 3 boyfriends think you are, unless you are doing something incredibly intimate with an iPhone, it has all been done before. It has all been done before. So my argument about the construction of homosexuality arising in the late 19th century is not that people began to have sex in a new way. That's not the case. But that it is at the end of the 19th century that one's sexual orientation, whom one has sex with, becomes a salient feature of one's identity. That prior to that, for example, in the early colonial period, human beings were not allowed to even live autonomously from families. You had to live in a family, even if you were an apprentice in somebody's workshop in, you know, colonial Boston or something. You lived with the family. You didn't live on, you know, you and your girlfriend didn't go get a place in town. It didn't happen. So the organization of our society, the economic and social organization of our society created the potential both for people to live autonomously, be congregated in large cities, and also begin to experiment and conceive of their sexuality, their identity, in a way that was previously inconceivable. It doesn't mean that they didn't have same-sex acts before, of course they did. But in the same way that pigmentation has always existed, and yet race was constructed by modern society, sex acts have always been in existence, but sexual identity, in the way that we understand it in modern society, has not always existed. And so I'll read for a moment from the book, and I take in the book from an analysis from John D'Amelio, who wrote a brilliant essay some 26 years ago called Capitalism and Gay Identity, and I expound on it in the course of the book. But here's how I write about the construction of homosexuality. Modern capitalism created the social space for a gay identity to emerge. Industrial and financial centers concentrated people in huge numbers, thereby creating the potential for anonymity that had never before existed in human societies. Having created the possibility for individuals to live apart from their families and to experiment with alternative sexual practices away from the narrowness of rural life, capitalist society then sought to define and repress this new sexual deviance. Industrial capitalism's hostility to homosexuality is unique in comparison to previous societies' laws punishing alternative sex practices. Whereas old laws condemned homosexual acts that threatened procreation, new proscriptions were enacted against the small class of people whose behaviors set them apart from the majority. So when we talk about this, the reason why I spend some time talking about the construction of homosexuality in the book is because it's important to understand where this identity comes from and why it begins to be repressed and then oppressed. Because there were earlier laws around issues of what was called sodomy, but sodomy was anything that was non-procreative sex. So all sorts of oral diddlings that straight people do, that was sodomy too. It was anything that didn't lead to procreation in a society that prized having children over all else. Because of course we lived in a largely agricultural society that needed to have more children, in which people would die at a very early age, so you had to have lots of children. Of course the same thing existed, and if anything only accelerated with the Industrial Revolution and the lack of any kind of hygiene, sanitation, etc. So it was procreation that was at the heart of those early laws, and what changed in the late 19th century was laws against specific kinds of people who began to be seen as different. And so you have the rise of the homosexual as well as the rise of the notion of heterosexuality. It's not that everybody walked around thinking that, you know, I'm straight. Nobody had this conception that you had a sexual identity. You were simply sexual. And the reason why this is important to understand is because there are actually material reasons for homophobia in our society. It's not just that there's a bunch of people out there with crappy ideas, although there are a bunch of people out there with crappy ideas. We call them bigots. That's why they're bigots. They have crappy ideas. But it has a material function in our society in which, after all, the zeitgeist, the goal of the people at the top of society is to make wealth, to make profit. And one means that they make profit is to foist onto the private sector what are really social needs. We're accustomed to all of this, right? So among those public needs, those social needs, childcare, cooking and cleaning, housekeeping, all of these kinds of functions that are performed in the nuclear family as we understand it today, that sort of Norman Rockwellian norm that's in every laundry detergent commercial and every sitcom, this is a creation of modern society. And they need this because they need this in order to get away on the cheap, right? Nuclear families are very convenient ways of, foisting, childcare is something that arguably you need to have. If you need to have people going off to work, then you need to have their children taken care of. Well, why does the state pay for such a thing? Well, they don't pay for such a thing because they've managed to convince us that it's our job to raise our own children. And then, of course, there are many ideological functions of families as well. There are ideal incubators of gender norms, right? That's where we learn how to be good little boys and girls, and where we're supposed to, boys are supposed to be, unemotional and indifferent to, important things, and girls are supposed to be utterly hysterical and unanalytical. It's where we learn how to be girls and boys, which have, of course, nothing to do with their biological reality. So the nuclear family, which of course has changed throughout time and throughout our lives, and very rarely ever mirrors what it's supposed to look like, according to the ideologues of the right and of the people at the top of society, nonetheless actually not only serves an ideological function, but a very important material function. I want to go on to talk about another question, and that is a question that has become, it's interesting because when I was coming up in the 1980s, the idea that you were born gay existed on the far reaches of the right. If it existed within the movement at all, it was among very conservative people that thought that people were born this way. And it's kind of made its way more towards the center of progressive movements. It's accepted and not really debated out or discussed out in any way. And of course, it's been heavily promoted by the media and by certain wings of, academic departments and what have you. And yet, the science around it is somewhat dubious. I mean, first of all, we have to ask the question, not that I oppose any kind of scientific endeavor, but why do they ask about the question of what causes people to be gay? They don't have deep scientific investigations that what causes somebody to be a warmongering bigot. I mean, there's a lot of them out there, but they don't say, well, we really need to study this question and see if there's a genetic origin to warmongering bigotry. And so it's supposedly some sort of deviance that we need to put under a microscope and find some sort of genetic or biological origin to it. And I think there is a problem to it, not the least of which, that there's no scientific evidence to this. Now, it doesn't mean, as we're often taught to think in our society, that if something is not biological, then it must be environmental, right? We're often thought to think in these sort of like switched terms, binary. If it's not nature, then it must be nurture. But I don't know that that's the most effective way of thinking about things. And actually, there's a professor out of Brown University, a woman by the name of Anne Fausto Sterling, who I think is absolutely brilliant. And she's written a number of books. One of them is called Sex and the Body, another one is called Myths of Gender. And the way she talks about this question, I think, is quite fascinating. She says, if the first take-home lesson in thinking about complex human traits is that linear, chain-like causal explanations are simply wrong, then the second is that the alternative idea of environmental determinism is also an oversimplification. In other words, there's an interplay between environmental and biological understandings and realities. And in fact, we don't really know whether or not something causes you to be gay. What we can say is certain kind of social formations allow people to express their homosexuality, or even allow people to conceive of pleasuring themselves or being pleasured in ways that other societal arrangements simply don't allow for.